Oh, great. And our guest, Bini, is back. Hello, hello.
Hi.
So once again, welcome everybody. This is the third session now of the Institute for Social Ecology's 2021 Summer Intensive, From Social Distancing to Social Transformation. And we are very pleased to have Bini Adamczak join us for our middle session today. She is a Berlin-based social theorist and artist who's written a host of books, some of which have been translated into English, some of which have not, on political theory, on queer politics, and on the past and future of revolutionary movements. Two of those translated books include Communism for Kids, which caused quite a stir when the US right-wing media industrial complex picked up on it, which never helps or never hurts the marketing purposes and book sales. That was probably a good idea. And Yesterday's Tomorrow, on the loneliness of communist specters and the reconstruction of the future, which just came out. Both books are available on MIT Press. And this latter, really speaks about how we confront the legacy of authoritarian left-wing movements and what does that mean for our vision going forward. So we're very pleased to have her join us today. So I will hand her the floor, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, Blair, for the introduction. Thank you all for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, even though it's very unclear what here means. I, for example, am in Berlin, and I guess most of you are somewhere else. And here it is 7:30 in the evening. So the here and now is very fuzzy in Zoom land. But I'm happy that I have been invited to this conference on social ecology, and I'm happy to be able to present my new book, Yesterday's Tomorrow, on the loneliness of communist specters. I was looking for it. I wanted to hold it into the camera, but could not find it, the one I had. I wrote it some years ago in English, but as Blair said, has just been published last month at the MIT Press. And there's a book that deals with the history of communism, with Stalinism, and poses the question how we can continue to fight for a better world. This means like a more libertarian, more egalitarian, more solidaric world, even though we are informed, should be informed about how other people fighting for very similar goals did not succeed, but instead failed, and failed massively. So the question is what this failure of the left means for us today and for our future. And to approach these questions, I will read from the book, 30 minutes, I guess, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion, looking forward to what you have to say to these questions, to the questions raised by the book. I jump right into it. The last warm rays of sun expire. Not a single bird takes off from the leafless trees. Not a single wingbeat can be heard. As if they have forgotten the point of flying, have lost the faith in being borne up by the air, the creatures perch on the slender branches. Slowly, the long shadows of the telegraph poles, once meant to connect the continent to come, retreat in the harvested fields. The odd forgotten blade of grass waits motionless in the windless early dusk. In the distance, scattered woodlands mingle with border villages history forgot. It is getting dark. Just maybe, though, there is a bit of light left. A fleeting night offers a glimpse of landscape animated by unchanged fieldwork. Here and there, the dew clings to the waves of grain. The first cars take to the road, and for a few kilometers, they pass alongside the rail. Something warm seeps through the tiny cracks in the vehicle. At times, the fog still clouds the view, which even without it would not be clear. After the day-long journey from Moscow or further away onto the Russian border, their eyes can grow weary watching the fields which rush past and yet in their immensity seem stationary. But the eyes of the German anti-fascists, the communist emigrants, see nothing. There are no windows in their barred compartments. Perhaps outside, the first patches of light are grazing the ground, while the mountains on the horizon stretch their stony heads upward to the dawning day. Or maybe it is already daytime. Possibly, even probably, it is bright out, because the weather bends seldom to the history writer's metaphoric wishes. A radiant day, white from the snow on the summits in the distance, from the glittering of the wide rivers, the multitudinous Polish lakes. The almost noonday sun stands in the otherwise empty sky, warms the roofs of the Stalapinsky carriages, rolling prisons where the inmates sit 7 to a car. The rattling of the train makes conversation between one compartment to the other impossible. For a time, songs are audible and encouraging words, but then, all at once, they fall silent. The wardens bring water and generous helpings of food, but now the prisoners have lost their appetite. Why now? Just eat. There's plenty of time for you to go hungry later, one of the soldiers tells them kindly. The soldiers are from the NKVD, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. This is the Russian secret police, and they have been ordered to bring a sealed cargo across the border, a silent human cargo. When the train slows down, the sun perhaps reaches its zenith, nature shows itself blind to history. In the train station, the anti-fascist prisoners step out, walk on foot for the final wooded stretch. On the train bridge from Brest-Litovsk, the newly established border, the road comes to an end. Other soldiers come from the other side of the bridge, raise their hands to their caps to greet the officers of the NKVD. The names are read out, the exchange begins. Those who resist and panic are shoved. The Jews among them are received with anti-Semitic tirades by the German soldiers, the soldiers of the SS. A train of many trains, of forgotten trains, special trains in which the NKVD transport German or Austrian communists to the German border, deliver them to the Gestapo. Of the 1,000 deportees, embassy and secret service files document conclusively more than 300 communists, Jews, and anti-fascists. A multitude of transports, the first already in 1935, the last in May 1941, 1 month before the outbreak of the war. They arrived in the Soviet Union as supporters of revolution, and most remained until 1933 or 1934. Some of them left only later, after years of fighting in the underground, building and rebuilding the Communist Party, the KPD, German Communist Party, without cease until their cover was blown and they had to escape. Many of them have been in German prisons, have suffered torture, some of them in the first concentration camps. They are anti-fascist. They even have the state seal of approval, and the Soviet authorities are strict in these matters. Only those who engaged in active resistance according to the standards of the KPD are allowed to immigrate. Anti-Semitic persecution, on the other hand, isn't enough to qualify for any offer to asylum. Persecuted by the Nazis, fleeing the threat of the camps, German and Austrian communists flee into Russian exile, into the Soviet Republic, the fatherland of the workers of the proletariat, to Moscow, the reddest city on the planet. Protection is not what they hoped for most, but the chance to go on contributing to the construction of socialism, to organize resistance to Germany in exile. Very few of them mean to stay. They want to go back with new papers, with a different mission. And back they go, but unarmed, not as revolutionaries, as Soviet soldiers, but rather as their captives. Not all the deported anti-fascists are freed after their interrogation to labor for the German cause or to fight soldiers. The Gestapo's orders exclude those who were active Marxist militants prior to emigration, those who engaged in political activities in the Soviet Union, who agitated against Germany, or who continued to cling to their communist convictions, as well as those of Jewish lineage. For these people, return means to prisons and ghettos, to concentration and extermination camps. Only a few of them survive, the rest will die there. In Lublin, in Neuengamme and Mauthausen, in Auschwitz and Majdanek. Like spokes in a wheel which seem to stand still, then turn backward, once it reaches a certain speed, these trains travel back from socialist Russia into National Socialist Germany, in the opposite direction of the sealed train that, decades before, had brought Lenin to Petrograd to wage revolution. Unceasing progress, which was meant to push history toward communism, with an inevitable leap from the first revolution in 1917 to the second, then to the worldwide revolution, ends here. Not halfway, how nice that might have been, not at the beginning, but even earlier. In the camps, almost naturally those of the enemy, but also incomprehensibly those of the Allies. Double betrayal. Betrayal of anti-fascism, betrayal of communism. You rarely get the first without the second, and you never have the second without the first. But above all, betrayal of the communists, of one comrade by the other. Betrayed to those who they had fought against for the better part of their lives from 1918 on, who were the focal point of their political rage. And betrayed by those for whom they sacrificed their lifetime, for whom they were willing to sacrifice their lives. Without a name, they die, without a struggle, most of them, not at the barricades, but behind them, in Moscow's prisons, deep in the Siberian steppes, back in the German camps. But how are we to remember them? How do we remember those of whom there is so little left to remember? And above all, with whom do we remember? Whom do we raise the alarm to? Whom do we warn or turn for help? Who do we call to in the name of a justice deferred, past due, of a zealous partisanship for those the party betrayed? With whom do we mourn the lost, the murdered, the abandoned revolutionaries? Abandoned in the train cars, hiding out in another country, betrayed in the concentration camps, subdued in tiny apartments in Moscow, in jail cells in Siberian work camps. They have no allies left, no friends across the border, no fellow fighters, no comrades back home, no one who takes heart at the thought of them, no one they might think of to fire their hopes. Who to share their loneliness with? At least that. At least to offer them companionship, imaginary, belated companionship. Perhaps like Vaso Milic, a character from a novel by Manish Berber, they carry out conversations with themselves as they await arrest. Conversations in truth addressed to friends across the border, the long deceased comrades who are the only ones capable of measuring the distance that separates the fall of 1939 from October 1970. To them, and to them alone, to those they shared the experience of a revolution with, the memory of that historically unique, world-spanning hope, could they convey the hopeless disappointment that has beset them. For a brief moment, they were granted, or at least caught a glimpse of, another life, the end of their history and the history of their ancestors. And then it was taken away. Perhaps nothing will ever compensate for this loss, certainly not in their brief lives or in any moment that has come after, all the way down to this very day. Rather, the loss itself will become lost. For their successors, this loss will be the precondition of their existence, the basis of their political experience. Even with great effort, they will remain incapable of understanding the revolutionary disappointment, though we, all the way down to this very day, are the children, in a strict historical scientific sense, of this disappointment. It is not us who experience the disappointment, but quite the opposite. We were made out of it. Not in absolute numbers, naturally, but in relative ones, the victims of Stalinist terror came most often from their own ranks, and the danger was greater the closer they stood to the center. Party membership increased one's chances of arrest. So these victims were communists. Who is to mourn them as communists? Who, if not the communists, whoever these might be? And yet, the communists, most of them, are silent. The archives are open since 1919, but no broad or deep research has begun, or very little, above all on the part of those who should be posing themselves question most urgently when, where, who should pose themselves questions without reprieve, how, why. Hardly any work of remembrance by those whose remembrance is most needed by those to remember. No silence is permissible, nor prevarication. Prevarication perhaps even less so. No shameful, guilt-ridden covering over the dead by those who, still trapped in the logic of the Cold War, take remembrance of the victims to be an anti-communist strategy, or feel uttering their names to be the incantation of a pro-capitalist curse. In their fears, they feel stalked by an army of corpses marching beneath the banner of counter-revolution, determined to track the last living communists down in their graves. In their blind defense of an allegedly real socialism, which was generally decent enough to refrain from using the C word in the present circumstances, they endorse, with an authority they are as communists entitled to, their enemies' assertion that this is what communism was, and an alternative, if not the only alternative to capitalism, to which, consequently, there is no real alternative. To the degree that these communists of the past protect the past from attacks by a victorious present, they defend a temporarily victorious past as presented from the perspective of a present in which Stalin's head will forever remain welded to Karl Marx's cheek. They take the side of the party that liquidated their standard bearers, position themselves behind the murderers who buried the revolution along with the murdered revolutionary. There may be no prevarication here, and just as little or almost as little silence. A naively joyful continuation of the present, an ahistorical continuation of history by those who dream of a future that would be capable of redreaming itself, that could start from zero, unburdened by the nightmares of the past. Free choice of a new terminology, or even just a new name, an unsullied name for the project of a probably something less than all-embracing emancipation. As though a new name could accomplish more here than a simple affirmation of good, purified, best intentions. As though it could also change something about the dangers that live on under an altered name, unimpeded by any knowing caution. In their rhetoric of a break with the past, which they cannot break with because they silence it, they do not even realize, these communists of the present, who as a rule do not call themselves communists, they bolster the enemy's assertion that the end of history has already been reached, because for them, this history is at an end. As though there were no predecessors, no combatants before. But to bury the past struggles for the future means nothing more, under the ongoing conditions of defeat, than burying the future itself. That is, another future. Wishing to keep their utopia free from past slaughters of the revolutionaries' weapons that turned on the revolutionaries, they isolate their dream from the history of power and power struggles, isolate their utopia from the reality it ought to strive to. Uninterested in the revolution's victories, lionizing only those revolutionaries who perished before they could make it far enough, they confirm that all they want is to dream and not to triumph. So both of them betray again those communists the communists already betrayed. They prevaricate and silence those who have already been fatally silenced. They labor away at the fantasy of a guiltless posture, which yields to the illusion that it is possible to start over from the top, from zero, or simply go on in an unbroken line, liberated from the painful work of and on history. But in this case, as perhaps in all such cases, the flight from history turns ever in a circle. In 1937, that long year that begins with the first Moscow show trial in August of 1936 and lasts until the last show trial in March of 1938, the October Revolution celebrates its 20th, its last anniversary. In 1937, amid the roar of the Great Terror, the Russian Revolution founders drowns in a plan like rush, chokes on itself. Independently of where it came from, independent of when exactly it began, the counter-revolution now attains its final triumph. Because it is, without a single doubt, a counter-revolution that reaches its conclusion in that year. It is such because it brings the revolution to an end, buries the last vestige of it, buries first of all, above all, the revolutionaries themselves. Of the 1,900 delegates of the 17th Party Congress, the Congress of Victors in 1934, 1,100 of them are imprisoned, disappeared, shot, buried after not even 5 years. Of the 139 party secretaries listed in 1936, only 7 remain in office. In 1937, the Red Army loses more officers than any army before in peacetime. The exiled Japanese Communist Party is decimated, as it is Germany's counterpart. The Polish party is thoroughly liquidated. In Leningrad, the capital of the revolution, as in the rest of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, 90% of all party cadres are locked up. Their bugs' nests of the Trotskyite fascists are smoked out and destroyed. The counter-revolution is exhausted. From Voronezh, the party functionary Andrei Andreyev telegraphs Moscow. Here, the Politburo no longer exists. All cadres have been imprisoned as enemies, now back to Rostov. Without a doubt, it is the Stalinist counter-revolution that liquidates the revolution, to employ a word loved by both. And at the same time, it surely is not. At no point does this counter-revolution declare itself to be a counter-revolution. At no point does it declare war on the achievements of the revolution. Indeed, what it declares war on is the counter-revolution. So not from without does it strike the socialist homeland, but from within, from the headquarters of the regime, from the center of the party. It organizes no military putsch, summons no allied troops from other countries, but rather unmasks on its own, constantly, tirelessly, the omnipresent conspirators, spies, agents of enemy powers. It marches not under the white banner, but under the red. And it fights not in the name of order, of freedom, of the market, but in the name of a revolution, of socialism, of plans. For it was planned, the great wave of terror, centrally, bureaucratically. A state socialist terror plan, just as precise and just as imprecise as state socialist economic planning. On July 30th, 1937, order number 00447 is issued. It demands the arrest of 332,000 people divided into two categories. 259,000 who are to be imprisoned for 8 to 10 years, category 2, and 72,000 who are to be executed, category 1. Repression, like production, should be carried out according to quotas. And the quotas, as always in the realm of the brave Stakhanovite workers, will be exceeded. In this socialist competition, the cadres outdo each other to prove their diligence, just as a certain Khrushchev, later renowned as an anti-Stalinist, who orders the execution of 55,741 suspects in response to a quota of 50,000. Soon, after just 1 month, the regional cadres demand an increase in their respective quotas. Soon, other orders succeed order number 447. After the liquidation of the former kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements, comes the liquidation of criminal elements, and then the liquidation of families of enemies of the people. When the wave of the terror runs down, 1,345,000 people have been sentenced, 681,000 of them to death. These judgments, representing 85% of all death sentences handed down during the Stalinist era, are carried out during the festivities marking the 20th anniversary of the revolution, accompanied by parades and merrymaking, framed by radiant banners. Life has become better. Life has become more cheerful. The future promised by communism never became present, nor did it remain future. Utopia lost. This strange, wispy phrase, which sounds rather like the title of a conference of theologians, means quite simply that today, the greater part of the future already lies behind us. This is the meaning of all talk of the end of history. It is the realization of the Popperian motto, which seems to have set the mood for the world after 1990, at least until 2011. The world that has been vindicated may not be the best of all worlds, but it is the best of all worlds that exist. It is sympathetically sedate compared to the mindless white lies of Stalinism. But right from the first, this slogan, which presents itself in the rhetoric of compromise as dispassionate cool-headedness, is beset with a dreadful sorrow. They have not stopped to linger because things are so nice, but rather because they lack the courage to go on. Movement is pointless. This is that makes the jubilant cries of the Cold War victors so unconvincing. They lack all joy. Instead, Instead of relief at averting looming danger or shared joy at the newfound fortune of the former oppressed, Russia's newly minted millionaires, it expresses something resembling embittered malevolence. The Schadenfreude those who stayed home feel for their siblings drowned at sea. Victory is thus tarnished by foregoing defeat. The anti-communists didn't win. They capitulated to the immutability of fate. Anti-communists do not win, they give up. They give up their dreams. Apologetics to the status quo are so based not on the celebration of reality, but on the restriction of mourning for the possible. Not on fear for what has been achieved, but on fear of what is achievable. Both, however, have their basis in history. That is the rationale for this book. So whoever doesn't want to talk about Stalinism had better keep quiet about communism. But on the other hand, what can be said about Stalinism by those who refuse to hear about communism? Those who wish to write the history of this past without writing about the history of that future that was buried in it. Just like relative value theory, the comparative analysis of domination always avoids the very thing it oscillates around eternally, namely domination itself. And domination itself can only be understood in light of its possible abolition. And this possibility, like all possibilities, exists subject to the peculiarity that its realization depends on its becoming real as a possibility. The possibility of freedom from domination does exist, but not a priori, only historically. Because this is the advent of communism. Unlike the ancient slaves who only wished to be as free as their masters, unlike the peasants who wanted to give the lords a tenth of their crop instead of the fifth, unlike the bourgeoisie who only wanted political freedom, not economic freedom, what the workers, the communist workers, demanded was a classless society. What the communists so promised was the abrogation of all dominance. And as long as they are remembered, they will never cease to have promised that. It is common for dominance to dress up as freedom. Since the bourgeois revolution at the latest, these are almost the only garments it has donned. But something has changed ever since the domination of those who fought against all domination in the world has entered the world. And all those who count off all the roads paved with good intentions or pronounce in resignation that power has won out over all ideas ignore this something. Man is born bad is the many-faced formula this work of mourning concludes in. The historical melancholy disguised as realism on a social level. Man is the enemy of man. He has always slaughtered his own and will go on doing so in the future. War yesterday, war today, war tomorrow. That sounds dreadful, but the reality is far more dreadful than this sounds. For the assertion of the repetition of the same is actually a consolation that covers over the true horror. If it was always bad, then really nothing bad has happened, nor can anything really bad ever happen. To have learned everything from the past, and therefore to be incapable of learning anything from the future, even when the only thing there was to learn was fear, is a pernicious consolation. A consolation that can no longer console, since a future has been promised in which the lessons of the past are no longer valid, in which there is no more cause for fear. Stalinism, this crime against the future of mankind, is so not just any dominance, not just one more form of dominance. but instead the first and paradigmatic link in an unbroken chain of disappointments that could only be so devastating because they were based on a hope unknown to earlier generations, at least in the modern world. That is why the first reproach against anti-communism must be that of downplaying the crimes of Stalinism. Not because an idea was murdered alongside the people in the gulags, how cynical, but because communism alone brought forth into the world the historically actionable demand to accept no disenfranchisement, to tolerate no more degradation. And since that time, even the slightest injustice grows greater, and the greatest pain hurts exponentially more. Thank you.
Thanks, Bini. That's fantastic. Can't wait to read the book. It's on my summer reading list, and I shared the link above via MIT Press. Okay, we can open up the discussion to get people on Stack. Thank you so much for that input. I forgot to mention too earlier in my rush to hand the floor to Bini that we know each other for many years through the Berlin radical left scene, and I knew we'd be fast friends when at our very first panel that we were on together, I don't know if you remember this, but you introduced the crowd, or you welcomed the crowd saying, "Greetings, anarchists, communists, socialists, syndicalists, Lando Calrissianists." And I was like, she's gonna be my friend. Okay, with that, I will open up the floor. There's been some discussion in the chat about related to your input. So would anyone like to kick us off? And I especially would like to encourage folks that haven't weighed in yet in the last couple of days. I like Mark's comment here. Bini's book is like a sequel, although in a completely different form, to Bookchin's Third Revolution, Volume 3. For me, the question is, where do we go from here? I'm sure that will be guiding all of our conversation. Damien, please, why don't you start us off?
Yes, thank you. I want to thank you for this presentation. It was amazing, really, really good. I just want to say, just a comment, how important it is to remember basically all of our fallen comrades and allies, because here in Chile we have this whole thing about remembering our people from the 70s and the 80s because of Pinochet, and yeah, it's extremely important for any single revolutionary idea or ideology to always keep in mind that a ton of people came before us and died because of it. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you. Claire, shall I?
We've got Justin is next on Stack, and if folks, I forgot to mention this because people were in here before, but we tend to use the asterisk, the little star. If you want to get on Stack, it's easier to see than the raised hand function when you have like 60 people or something. So why don't we take a few and we can try to find points of commonality. So we've got Justin and George. And if you could also, folks, when you, as Damien just did, when you ask your question, if you could just say your name and where you're from, that'd be great. Just, it's nice to get to know each other a little bit, at least know where we're coming from. Justin?
Okay, cool. My name is Justin. I'm a libertarian socialist and a communalist that lives in Asheville, North Carolina in the United States. And I have a big question because we have a couple of Marxist-Leninist a few Marxist-Leninist parties, with the biggest Marxist-Leninist party being the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in Asheville. And I would like to ask you, Bini, about your criticisms of modern Marxist-Leninist formations that you've seen around the world and also in Germany, because I know you have the link over there, and especially things like, campism, Marxism, and also things like Uyghur genocide denial and geopolitical games that they have. And I really think, because I think the issues that I've seen around Marxist-Leninists around those issues are a continuation with what your presentation is here. And I would like to hear your opinion about that.
Thanks, Justin. George, you want to pose your question or make your comment as well?
Okay. My name is George Poulados. I'm in Patras, Greece. For the time being, I'm with no one. I have a good relationship with Ingrid. I imagine Bini knows Ingrid. It's the creation of a Marxist dictionary in Berlin. Yes. Anyway, let's go to the questions. The first of all, I will read your book. I didn't even know there was a book translated in Greek. Congratulations on that. I will read it, and I hope sooner than later. The first question is, I have 2 or 3 questions really. The first question is, do you think that the Russian Revolution was very important and did it affect the way people looked at the world, especially the workers? The second is, starting from a council communist viewpoint, that the failure or the counter-revolution has to do with the rise of bureaucracy, and I don't just mean red tape. I mean like a new class that denied the working class to take over the rule of the country or the nation. The third thing has to do with the rigidness of the new regime. It has to do with that they were attacked, we discussed this yesterday in a smaller group, from 20 countries, among them being Greece and the United States. And this new regime managed to win the war. It's amazing. And the fourth question is, okay, we have many things we can talk about, but how does one see the future? What we should do is find, of course, things that elements that can help us unite and not divide, but which will be the elements that will help us to move on. Thank you.
Blair, I have to start answering. It gets too complicated. These are very interesting questions,
please.
But like not like just minor details questions. These are like, you know, opening up a wide range of debates. I'm starting with the second question. Yes, of course, there is still this kind of traditional socialism, like Marxist Leninism, still in the world. And if you look really on a global level, you know, also looking to China, to India, for example, it's not completely minoritarian, but mainly in the West, things have changed due to the course of history, due, for example, to the revolution of 1968, which was like a massive split in the international socialist movement, but also in the Marxist movement. And more Marxists started criticizing the reactionary path that Stalinist socialism, real existence socialism, had been taken on. And of course, in 1968, the new left also tried to create a new tradition, therefore focusing on, for example, anarchist ancestors more than on, let's say, for example, Lenin, right? I mentioned these traditional communist Marxists in my talk. I called them communists of the past, who still live somewhat in the framework of, let's say, the 1920s, or the framework of the Cold War, in which they believe that any kind of criticism, be it a leftist criticism of not emancipatory criticism or a reactionary one, any kind of criticism of the Soviet Union, of real existence socialism, will hurt the project of socialism altogether. And this, of course, creates a deadlock situation. Then you cannot formulate any progressive emancipatory criticism because you think only the right will gain from that. And my perspective is, of course, to overcome this deadlock situation, criticize from a leftist perspective radically, or let's say even from the communist perspective, radically communist history. And by doing so, also to be able to overcome the division the historical created division of, let's say, Marxists and anarchists. Because if we look down in history, you can find the points in which this division broke open. And if you go through the history and do the work of mourning on that history, you can also, this is what I believe, overcome this division. Now, answering the third question, yes, I think the Russian Revolution is extremely important for the history, and especially for the history of the left, even today. And I think that everybody who is, let's say, criticizing capitalism, for example, criticizing capitalism because capitalism will inevitably destroy the climate, everybody who criticizes capitalism will at one point or another be confronted with people who argue, well, but what is it that you offer then? And how can you ensure that what you are fighting for will not end again in the Gulag, right? So you might consider yourself a communist in the Marxist tradition or not. Whenever you start criticizing capitalism, you will be confronted with this history, and in some form or another, you will have to deal with it. Then the question, of course, you have to ask yourself, was this tradition wrong altogether, or did it fail at some point? And this is exactly what I'm doing in the book. I'm trying to go back. I started in this year 1939. These were the passages that I read, and then I tried to go back to 1917, to the beginning of revolution, always posing the question: when did it go wrong? Could they have taken a different path? And I'm working with the terms that I borrowed from the historian Enzo Traverso, who thinks it is important to distinguish between failure and defeat. Defeat is what you suffer from the enemy. If there is an army attacking you from the outside, or the counter-revolution, you can be defeated. What happened to the Paris Commune, for example? What happened also in Greece, for example, with the leftist movement in 2012 and so on. Failure, on the other hand, is failure in regard to your own ideals. Is a political failure. And the Russian Revolution is the paradigm for a socialist failure. But it could have only become the paradigm for socialist failure because it succeeded. Because it was victorious, because it was not defeated. It itself defeated counter-revolution and then failed. And I discussed this in the end of my book with regard to the example of Kronstadt, 1921, and to Chile, Pinochet. And I bring these two revolutions in a conversation, because the question raised is, how do you deal with counter-revolution? In a way, history has taught us that counter-revolution is almost inevitable. Those in power, the bourgeoisie, will not give up their power that easily. And then the question rises, how do you deal with it? You can either decide, well, it is no purpose of in fighting in military fashion against counter-revolution, and you can somehow give up, or you fight against counter-revolution with the possibility to be victorious, which is what the Russian Revolution did. But in order to succeed against counter-revolution, they themselves militarized, they themselves became authoritarian. So the same means that allowed them to be victorious against counter-revolution were also the precondition for their failure. And this is the dilemma of revolution that we have to deal with.
Thanks for that very nuanced answer, Bini. I didn't see anyone else on Stack, so I actually had a question myself. And that is, I mean, you're coming obviously from the German and more broadly the European context, where there's obviously a much stronger and less, let's say, perhaps suppressed, politically suppressed history of communism. This is a word that's made a comeback, I would say, in the last 10, 15 years in the American left. People like Jody Dean, magazines like Commune have started to reappropriate this language. And on the other hand, the Institute for Social Ecology, or Murray Bookchin, although he, began as a communist and then a Trotskyist and a utopian and an anarchist for many years, and then finally a communalist, he remained a communist in terms of a small c communist, believing, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, till his dying day. So his own political identification shifted over time, and yet because he identified and wrote for the most of his life as an anarchist, social ecology tends to have a lot of folks that come from the anarchist or libertarian socialist tradition. And then, of course, we've also had this resurgence of, democratic socialism with DSA in the United States, which is maybe somewhere, I don't know how we put those different poles into place. But in any case, I'm curious. I mean, I think there's often a lot of kind of divergent languages and identifications due to these historical factors, and it can be very easy to talk past one another. And especially, I'm curious, coming from your perspective and in Europe, do you sense those differences or those barriers when you interact with folks from especially the North American left, but also the left elsewhere? And what do you, I don't know, do you have thoughts on how we close those gaps, or where some of the points of convergence or divergence are? Because I noticed it very quickly when I moved to Berlin. I mean, I came from a background where most people identified as an anarchist, and some as a socialist, and there everyone was a Marxist or a communist, even though I felt that we were all anti-statists and we had a lot in common, but there were nonetheless different backgrounds. So I'll stop there.
Well, I would say that the differences that I feel are stronger between the West and the East. Less between the US and Europe, but more between Western Europe and the US, and Eastern Europe, Russia, India, China, and so on, because the feelings that people who lived through real existing socialism have towards socialism or communists differ strongly from those people that did not have this experience. But even this has changed in the last decade, I would say. So my book, for example, has been published in many countries. Like the first book, Communism for Kids, has been published in many countries which were part of the Warsaw Pact, in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia, even Russia, and has been also published in China. And so the discussion even there is shifting. And I myself, I'm really not so much interested in identity politics. And I find it very funny that the left is often discussing identity politics, but very seldomly regarding that all this labeling that you just propose, demonstrated, anarchist, libertarian, communist, Marxist, communist, this is all labels, right? This is all identities. And these are often like shortcuts that I think make it easy to have a simple orientation in the political world and be make some distinctions and be I'm with them, I'm against them. But I'm more interested in the concepts, right? And those shift historically. And this is something that we all can see in our lifespan in the last years, that a term like socialism has become something that you can claim again in the United States of America, right? It's really weird to see that if you have some polls, there's more people, or in this case, young people, being in favor of socialism than ever in the history of the United States of America, as far as I'm informed, right? And of course, due to the world economical crisis, which in my understanding also ended the end of history. And then this is, I think, also like the reason why my book Communism for Kids was published in the US after all, because the Occupy movement shifted the conversation so strongly, so massively. And if you are able to speak about socialism, then again you're also able to speak about communism. And I don't think that there's like these shortcuts that you can identify the heart of the problem with just like one term. I think it is important to work through the history. And this is why I am always proposing a more like a borderlining approach, working between the histories of anarchism and democratic movements and Marxist movements and so on. Because the questions that we have to answer are much too difficult than to give them to these shortcuts. And as Engels and Bakunin both have pointed out, neither of the movements has been successful in the way we've been dreaming of, you know. So this is a starting point. If everybody failed, the discussion should be open.
Great. So why don't we take inputs from Parhes, Roberto, and Forrest next? Group those.
Hi, yeah. Sorry, this is actually Tiz. Yeah, I thank you for that point. I think that's just such a good point in that like so much of these political identities kind of goes to like this kind of like oppositionalism and reduces down to sort of like identity politics. And I think that just to me kind of comes down to like an interesting point where what are those intersecting like elements? And I think like communalism and social ecology is interested in building like a cohesive, coherent, you know, kind of political philosophy that connects to like a political strategy that's thinking through itself from the beginning to the end. And I think in a lot of ways, lots of people who are getting interested in like Marxist-Leninism and so on are attracted to that, particularly today, because there is a sort of coherence to this political program that's being offered. You have like the material dialectic, you know, analysis that you can sink your teeth into, and a lot of people who I'm seeing like getting burnt out on anarchism are turning to that kind of approach because there's answers to questions, and in that they're not finding in, you know, the kind of more incoherent realm of contemporary anarchism. And I think like social ecology and the natural dialectics that Bookchin develops is a really great way to find that kind of like commonality in that, or that kind of unifying point, in that there is more to go to. It's not just an identity. It's not just the communalist identity, but there's more thinking through all of the points from your ethics to your political practice here, that I think if we actually start engaging in more substantive political conversations about, you know, what is we're doing, why are we doing it, you know, we can kind of move forward from there. And I think, you know, to the point of like counter revolution, I think there's examples such as like the PKK or even Nestor Makhno's platformism, where Makhno over 100 years ago was looking at the problems and difficulties of contemporary anarchism, really unifying the movement and the need for these kind of ideologically unified organizational structures. And I think in a way, you can look at the PKK as a organization that kind of had some of those elements under a Marxist-Leninist Maoist kind of formation that then took on elements of like, you know, Bookchin, which I see it, you know, and the way that they interrelate in Rojava society with those movements is similar to what I see as like in platformism, in the sense of having these really ideologically kind of, you know, unified, or even a specifismo, if you're familiar with that movement, where you then are inserted within the society and you're able to make the, you know, influence that, argue your position, but then also have these kind of strong, well-organized, unified, militant revolutionary forces, sort of like a vanguard, you know? And I think that, you know, was the question of, you know, not part. Huh? Sorry.
You could wrap it up. That'd be great.
Yeah. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on like that kind of idea of like how all of that kind of fits together, and with what from where you're coming from. Check.
Let's take a couple more. We've got Roberto and then Forrest.
Yes, I think what we have to emphasize when we talk to people about who are coming into the movement very early is the difference between the state and autonomy, because that's the key point that we're trying to make, is that the reason that so many of these communist movements degenerated into authoritarianism is because they're within a state system, which is, as Bookchin keeps pointing out, or kept pointing out, was authoritarian, hierarchical from the beginning. So it's like in my city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, we have we had a DSA group, and then I noticed some of the people in DSA were saying, well, we're the largest leftist group in the United States, and we're growing very fast, and we just passed 100,000 members. But they don't talk about the state, unless you're part of the Libertarian Socialist Caucus. The majority of DSAers are still behind, like the state systems in Norway, in Northern Europe, and Bernie Sanders type of socialism under a state. And to me, those are dead ends. Even they don't look like it now. A lot of people say, "Oh, that's great that people in Sweden and Norway are doing so great, and they still are capitalists." But I don't think that's going to last, because it's still an authoritarian top-down system. And I think that we got to emphasize that with new people that are coming into the movement, because right now, they, like I pointed out, everybody goes on the information they have at the time, and right now we have to provide new information that's more relevant to our situation now. And what we're learning from this woman who's talking about, the history of socialism, communism, is that it's the state system that's the key weakness, which I in my seminar on indigenous versus capitalist values, I pointed out there's two values that communism shares with capitalism, and one of them, of course, is a top-down governing system, and the other is love of industrialism. So, what do you make of those ideas, thoughts?
Why don't we take one more from Forrest, then we can do that chunk, and then we have Evan and Laura we'll circle back to.
Yeah, hey, my name's Forrest. I'm actually a member of the Asta TU Berlin. Yeah, thanks. That was first just straight up really, really interesting. It was nice to have you read from your book. I just would like to say too, I think a lot of times as an American, I think I've learned a lot since I've moved to Berlin, hopefully. And one of those things is too, I think a lot of times we talk about like communism degenerating and stuff too, but I think it's also important to look at like Öcalan and Bookchin, where a lot of it started in a Marxist-Leninist thought and also moved into developing the communalist idea in a way. And I think it's important to avoid these identity politics. That was my input.
Why don't we stop there, Bini, and you can answer, pull together threads as you please.
Well, I think like in a way, all the three questions and comments circle around, especially the relation between an anarchist or tradition or communalist politics and a Marxist tradition, right? And I've worked a lot on these questions, and I think well, a lot of it can be said if you look into the history. I think speaking to the first comment, it is true that one way that Marxism remained important throughout history was by its retreat to the realm of the academic world, right? It is Marxism provides a complicated theory, but also a striking analysis, especially of the economical sphere, so of capitalism, while many intellectuals are often like not so much satisfied with anarchist theories, or you have at least much less theory making. At the same time, if you look into history, you know, and you look at the decisions anarchists and Marxists were making, I would, to put it simply, say very often were the anarchists making the right decision, where the Marxists were making wrong decisions. So their complicated theories did not always, you know, help. But at the same time, of course, there are some theoretical political interventions that also help to overcome some shortcomings in anarchist practices and theory, right? And namely, for example, the personalization of abstract domination, of structural domination. I would argue that it is important to discuss this relationship and to go through history. And of course, I agree that the question of the state is like central in a way to this debate. But it's also interesting to see that, for example, the last text that Vladimir Ilyich Lenin wrote before the revolution, or even like in the revolution, State and Revolution, is an almost anarchist text. Like for him, it's a very anarchist text, it's a very anti-state text. You know? But this anti-state perspective that he took in the beginning of the revolution had very, very few effects on Leninist politics. Yeah, but I think one thing, it is important to work through, if we think about this relationship, it's important to work through the 1970s, where anarchism again became much more important, which is also, I think, then probably the starting point for Bookchin to get into these debates. Then, of course, we look at the Spanish Civil War, where the Stalinists betrayed anarchists so massively. And then 1921, Kronstadt, and 1920, the Makhnov Revolution, the Makhnov guerrilla in the Ukraine, which the Bolsheviks, which Trotsky betrayed. And then, of course, we have to go back to the First International and the fight between Kropotkin and Marx, and to see how very often Bakunin and Marx, how Bakunin was often right, was often posing the right question, whereas Marx, you know, tried to get rid of these questions in a very arrogant way, and he could have profited from this perspective. But speaking about like identity politics, if you look at the Spanish anarchists, the society they were fighting for, they did not call it anarchist society, they called it libertarian communism. So these anarchists were fighting for communism. And then, of course, if you look at Öcalan, and if you look at the PKK, and if you look at Rojava, the relation remains, of course, very, very complicated. And of course, you can narrate the story in a very funnily way, that you say, okay, you have a Marxist-Leninist party, which is very centralized and authoritarian. And then the head of this authoritarian party gets interested in anarchism and tries to introduce non-hierarchical politics in a hierarchical way. And then you can look how much does this work. And of course, if you look more closely, it is not that the PKK has become like this anarchist grassroots movement, right? it is still a very, to a huge extent, an authoritarian traditional Marxist-Leninist party, although they adapt some anarchist or libertarian rhetoric. Rojava is something else. Rojava is not the PKK, of course, and there you have like this communalist organization. But still, I think it is important to pose the questions as objective questions, not as questions of identity, of labeling, and of the right theory. And then, of course, the question with the state is the question that I tried to pose before, because what Lenin says in State and Revolution is not the state is a nice thing. We should keep the state for all eternity. But what he says is like we have a tactical relationship towards the state, and we have to take over the state in order to smash counter-revolution. This is the argument. And then the question, of course, always remains: can we get rid of the state and still have the means to deal with an organized counter-revolution? And if we decide to work with or within the state, is there any possibility to get rid of the state afterwards? Or will we see the same story playing out again? As soon as you're in the state, as soon as you're working with the state, you're reproducing the state and make it even stronger.
Thanks, Bini. That was great. The chat and the conversation in the chat's been great too. Why don't we circle back and let Laura, Evan, and Trison say their piece. Laura, you want to kick us off?
Yes, hi. I have two questions actually. The first one is, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the transition from people who originally started out as Trotskyites becoming the founders of the neoconservative movement, which I've always found to be a very strange thing that happened. And the second question has to do with this criticism. I don't know if you're familiar with it, and this may be more of a US context, I'm not sure, but this criticism that has been coming up in regards to identity politics and what we call cancel culture, call out culture, etc., having kind of like elements that are reminiscent of Maoism and the Cultural Revolution in terms of this sort of like public humiliation and privilege shaming and, all this sort of stuff that kind of has those elements to it. And I am curious to your thoughts on that, because personally, on the one hand, I really can actually see the validity of that criticism. And I'm someone who's saying this who really actually very much comes originally from a very pro-intersectional, pro-identity politics position. But over time, I have started to see some very concerning tendencies and patterns that do really strike me as classically authoritarian in a leftist context. So, for example, I'm seeing some rising support for the death penalty in those in those quarters, which I never would have thought possible. I'm definitely seeing, very, very rigid sort of dogmatic stances on you can't question anything ever. And you must lead, without questioning. You must follow the leader being, of course, whoever comes from the most marginalized group, but you can't ever question them. You must lead them unquestioningly, and even support for authoritarian leftist leaders overtly. So I do see the criticism on that. But on the other hand, I also do see the reasons for why there are these ideas like, listen to the most marginalized person, center the most marginalized person, don't speak over the most marginalized person, don't tone police them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of validity to those original ideas, but I am really concerned that they are going in a very authoritarian direction. So yeah, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on, do you see this as a concern, as a valid criticism? Is it really kind of showing those patterns? And what can we do to stop it from going in that authoritarian left way, but yet still honor the valid parts of those ideas?
Mm-hmm. Blair, can I answer directly, because it gets very complicated, I think,
Sure.
always when we have like a, maybe I can also be a bit shorter then.
Sure.
I mean, starting with the first question, I think, yeah, of course you can see this development from Trotskyites to conservatives, but again, you can see this from almost every political angle. You know, you can see it from revolutionary socialists, from queer feminists, you can see it from anti-racist people fighting against anti-Semitism, and you can see it also from anarchists. We have popular examples, for example, in Germany, some people who were more in an anarchist, or let's say spontaneous autonomist movement later became the foreign minister of Germany, starting a war, right? Then of course, what I would argue is that you have never an assurance, a theoretical or political assurance that would prevent you systematically from these developments, because it's a question of history, it's a question of power, it's a question of forces. And again, with the identity politics, and I would agree that cancel culture, of course, is a term of the right, you know, but still, you can see these authoritarian aspects in leftist movements again and again, and then I would agree. You can see these analogies. When I was writing text about it or against it, when the debate was very strong in Berlin, I sometimes put it in the text, but only to a small extent, because at the same time you can also see the connection to, for example, let's say Christianity, because this idea that we are all sinners and that we have to get rid of these sins and help others in the community to get rid of it and so on, you can argue it's an idea that is even older than leftist socialism. But I think the way you phrased this is very much the way I would also try to look at it, and to see it as a dialectic, like to reconstruct the argument. You can see, okay, we live in a society, let's start from here. We live in a society of power, of domination, so we decide to fight against it. And the next step, we realize, but this society has also created us. We are subjectivated by it, we are socialist by it. So we find this stuff in ourselves. So it's a very legit idea that we also focus on ourselves, start criticizing ourselves. But then, of course, there's this moment, like a dialectical moment, where this focusing on yourself becomes like the only point of attention, and does not allow you, for example, to form alliances and to see like the greater structures. At the same time, you can say, yeah, there are some people who are always silenced, so it is very important to hear their voices and so on, to have like a perspective of situated knowledge, as Donna Haraway calls it. But then again, if you think that it is only this the position from where somebody is speaking, you know, that is the only question that allows to consider the truth of an argument, then becomes extremely dogmatic and is not emancipatory at all anymore. And yeah, this is like the very same perspective that I'm taking to the socialist movement. You know? Try to understand where the question comes from, and see where it flips to its own opposite, where the emancipatory perspective becomes reactionary in itself.
Thanks, Bini. Evan, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, hi. I just echoing what other people said, thank you very much. This was great, and I'm very excited to read your book. I will just be quick, but I feel it's a little unfair because I haven't been able to read the book. So perhaps you answer the question in the book. And if you've already said things that might answer this question, I am happy to cede stack to the next person. But it's about language a bit. So, you know, in the event we're in with this social ecology kind of framework, there's a lot of talk of epistemology and how we know what we know. And part of that to me is how we communicate with each other and that knowledge, and, you know, how we create conversations. And so some of the dichotomy that seems to emerge from the positioning you're taking of looking at this history is, you know, the baggage of our, you know, the pain people have experienced and atrocity and the difficulty that exists in the past, and ways that we can push forward, both while honoring that and still transcending it in some ways. And so, you know, how can we, I guess it's not so much a specific question as much as if you have thoughts on how the language we use, you know, whether it's in title or identity, as we were just talking, or focusing more on the broader pictures of programs and values, like how we can balance that language between still pushing forward to advance things and transcend certain old paradigms, while also honoring and you know, accepting the baggage of the past and the harm of the past in those conversations. Yeah.
Do you want to do one by one, Bini? Wait, we only have one more person, I think, on stack after this.
There's many people or not?
I think just one more at the moment.
Oh, okay. Well, no, then I would answer that. I think that the question of language is extremely important, but then again, sometimes language gets so much attention that is also not helping so much. But I think language is, for me, for example, in this book, as in the book before, language is very important in connection to desire and affect. And I think this is something that I believe we should focus more on, because we often find ourselves in a language that's very like analytical language, you know, like a language also very often borrowed from political science and so on, is an academic language, which by definition is trying to get rid of subjectivity and getting rid of affect. But the questions that we're discussing, question of emancipation, of pain, as you framed it, of domination, of hope, is also a question of affect. And this is something that should also be considered in the language, right? Are we able to transport this in the language or not? You know? Because it is very much about desire. So for me, like for the decision to write a children's book, Communism for Kids, was that the children's language is usually considered a language of easiness, you know, lightness, and also a language of desire and wish. Right? And what better language to get rid of this melancholic atmosphere of the end of history, nothing can be done, and so then this language of, you know, what, just consider what do we want, how do we want to live, you know, everything else we can deal with later. But then again, if you talk about the history of this desire, if you talk about Stalinism, of course you need a completely different language, and this is why the language, and I hope it has become clear in the reading a bit. I think the translator did an amazing job. This is a language that's a bit poetic, but it is dealing with the mourning, right? So it is trying to get into that history and steer these emotions up, because I really believe we have to find a way of dealing with it in order to go.
Tryson.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm in Virginia in the US. And I think you might have touched on this already, but my question is kind of in discussing or thinking about next steps and how education and awareness is so much of an important step in all of that. if you have any ideas of how to engage people who are not politically necessarily conscious or don't even have the option to be politically conscious due to like outstanding circumstances and just the stressors of capitalism in general, and how to engage them given that the language of politics is often very particular, very hard to get into. Yeah.
That is a big question, but I'm sure like there's many people here have like some thoughts on that. One way that I would answer is also to really ask the question, why is it that people, as you describe it, don't have a political language, or don't feel like drawn to political discourse, you know, and try to see that the reasons for that, not to see the rational in it. For example, as I said, if somebody tells you, well, I'm really not into all this socialist communist crap because it failed drastically, and then you had the Gulag and so on, that's a good argument, you know. So, there's no ideology in it. It's really true. It's a very, very good point. If somebody says, hey, I just don't have any time for politics, you know, I have to deal with my personal shit, and I have to make some money, and then all this other stuff, it's a good argument. And I think, you know, you should find the rationale in it, and then start from that, you know. Why is it that we have so little time to deal with politics? And also, what is politics, you know? Politics is not Bernie Sanders and the DSA. Politics is happening in your life, you know, that you need a job, you know, that you desperately need for money. This is politics already, you know, because that you think you need a family and so on, and that you think in this concept. This is politics, and yeah, that would be my answer. Start from there.
Okay. I believe we've gone through the entire stack. Unless anyone has any other questions, maybe we would hand it back to Bini for any closing remarks or summarization reflections.
I have one question. It's quite simple, really. The first question is, two questions, really. The one is, how many books have you written? And the second is, why did you select MIT Press? MIT Press, I imagine, expresses the academic elite. Why would someone who has ideas about communism, socialism, social ecology, and so on and so forth, publish in such a academic publishing house?
Better distribution. I have written 4 books, you know, by myself, and those that have been translated are the first. Communism for Kids I wrote in 2003, and Yesterday's Tomorrow I wrote in 2007. And there's also like two translators interested in translating Yesterday's Tomorrow to Greek. I don't know how it is going along, but they were planning on translating. And of course, now other publishers from all over the world start to get interested, because everybody's of course only looking to the English language or the American market, and whatever happens there becomes interesting. I did not choose MIT. It's more that the MIT got interested. You know, it was the translators, Jacob Blumfeld and Sophie Lewis, who were reaching out to different publishers, and I think they also were reaching out in the beginning to the more leftist publishers and so on. Then I could tell you some anecdotes why some of them were not interested, and what this has to do with some like weird political distinctions and with political conflicts that you would not think of in the beginning. But anyhow, MIT then was interested, and as I already said, I think they were interested because the Occupy movement had happened, and there was this growing interest in socialism, and this is why like such a big publishing house then thinks, okay, we can find an audience, we can sell this. This is how capitalism works, you know. And if capitalists think they can sell communism, they will do it, you know. And of course that gave a lot of distribution, but also a lot of publicity. And what Blair pointed out, for me, was not so comfortable, I must say, when the right and the anti-communists attacked Communism for Kids. Personally, was not so comfortable, but of course it created a publicity for the book. And part of this outrage by the right was that the book was published by MIT, because they also consider MIT their university, you know, the technology university, a conservative, like a Republican somehow university. Why is this university? And then all these former students called the MIT press and asked them to refrain from this book and so on, which they didn't do.
Thanks, Bini. Any other questions or comments? Isaac, please.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just that one quick question. I heard Bini mention something about Donna Haraway and knowledge when you were answering someone's question about identity politics. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, yes. I mean, I find this the whole project here, the social ecology, like very fascinating, extremely important. And I've been reading on these topics in a broader sense lately, and I've been drawn to these two authors, Donna Haraway and Karen Barat. I think that they answer these questions also of epistemology and the relation of epistemology to ontology in a very radical way. And especially Donna Haraway is trying to overcome these divisions of like nature, nurture, you know, nature, culture, also by creating a different language. Also coming back to this question, because we need a different language in order to create a different imaginary to overcome these inherited distinctions that come from this at least modern tradition, but actually are much older, also like, you know, also embedded in Christianity. It's this idea of man and environment. And this is why she creates all these different terms to allow us to think differently. And Barat does it, also does it. And I think it's very interesting how they overcome these distinctions between also the scientific disciplines, you know, one being a biologist and a socialist feminist, the other being a theoretical physics, PhD, or professor or whatever, scholar, and a gender studies, queer feminist, Marxist. And Donna Haraway, to answer your question, wrote this text already, I think in the 80s, Situated Knowledge. And I believe that in this text, she answered the question, or she solved the problem of universalism and particularism, or like objectivity and subjectivity. When she said, well, if you believe that you have an objective relation towards truth, this is an ideology. You are always looking at the world from a certain perspective, but you cannot reframe this perspective, say, okay, I have my truth, you have your truth, you know, and that's it, this liberal idea. No, only by acknowledging the situatedness of your perspective, of acknowledging your perspective, you can participate in a discourse with others in which you can find like a more objective truth in a way together. So it is neither simply universalist nor simply particularist, but is trying to overcome this division by acknowledging the situatedness of your knowledge, but not by sticking to it in an identitary fashion, but acknowledging the situatedness of your knowledge in order to overcome this specific locality. bringing together different perspectives.
I see Anissa had a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks. I guess, yeah, I'm still learning a bunch of this history and trying to unpack the intense stuff that we are inheriting as younger activists. But I guess my question for you and anyone here, like I'm recently involved in a project where we're trying to blockade a mining conference, and we're trying to build kind of unity across different groups that have hated each other for a long time. And one of the most interesting and difficult parts is the Trotskyist groups. And I've tried to understand where they fit in this history, because, you know, they're often like, oh, we thought, you know, Trotsky thought Stalin was bad from ages, so we were always right. But whenever we try and engage in an actual dialogue, it's this weird kind of culty, you know, I feel like they're just speech. They just want to do speeches rather than actually dialogue. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas in how to like deal with that, anything, if anyone has anything I can read to try and situate that, or people have, anyone here has ideas how to deal with that, because they're going to be around and we're going to be working with them. So
where are you from?
Melbourne, Australia.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think the Trotskyists in itself are as diverse as the left, you know. You know probably this joke. What do two Trotskyists do when they meet? They split the party, you know. And both believe that they represent the international, right? They have formed many internationals. I think of all the figures of the authoritarian Marxism, Trotsky is one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting, as a historical figure, because you must know that he started out quite differently. First of all, he was like this Jewish intellectual who sat in Vienna reading German literature and so on, and then later became the head of the Red Army, who was never trained in any of that, and then just read all the books about military theory, and with that was able to win a war against trained militaries from all Western Europe, right? So it's amazing. But what you also have to know is that he was a very harsh critic of Lenin, of Leninism, of the Lenin authoritarianism. You find quotes from him, by him from 1905 and earlier, where he sees very clearly in which direction Lenin and the Bolsheviks are going, and he shows very clearly why this path will not lead to an emancipatory society. Later on, he joined the Bolsheviks and became even more authoritarian than Lenin himself, being responsible for the betrayal of the Makhnovshchina, of the Ukrainian anarchists, and for the destruction of the Kronstadt rebellion. I, for example, for Gestern Morgen, for Yesterday's Tomorrow, read a book by Victor Serge, a French anarchist, who was, at the start of the war in 1914, imprisoned, and then deported to Soviet Russia. And he came as an anarchist to Soviet Russia and then became a Trotskyist, because he believed only when joining the Bolshevik party he would be able to make a real difference. Then later, together with the Trotskyists, he was sent to jail by a Stalinist regime, and then freed by an international solidarity movement, liberated, and came to France. And at this time, he started writing letters to Trotsky, who was in the beginning also in Paris and then later emigrated to Mexico, and tried to discuss the history of early socialism of the Russian Revolution with Trotsky, and arguing, yes, I read also your book on the Russian Revolution, of the betrayal of the Russian Revolution by Stalin, and I agree with most of it, but don't you have to agree that the destruction of the Kronstadt rebellion, which you are responsible for, was also a massive step in the direction of Stalinism. And Trotsky was not willing to admit to this massive failure. And this is why then Victor Serge, the former anarchist who became a Trotskyist, broke up with Trotsky again, and declared that he would no longer be a follower of Trotsky. With this, I mean, it's like a lot of historical anecdotes, but I wanted to show also how there is no fixed identity, how Victor Serge can become from an anarchist to a Trotskyist to a critic of Trotsky, and Trotsky himself was a very strict critique of authoritarianism, who then later became authoritarian and a very famous critique of Stalin. Maybe knowing this history might help in engaging with these Trotskyists, and maybe they will be irritated when they learn that you can criticize Trotskyism with Trotsky himself.
Yeah, well, whenever anyone brings up Kronstadt with them, they kind of seem to lose it and can't deal with the idea.
No, they can't deal with it.
It's fascinating to watch. And like lots of movements all over, there's understanding it through a cult lens has helped me a lot.
Yeah. Then maybe the early text of Trotsky, where he criticizes centralism, where he criticizes Lenin, maybe this might be interesting.
Thank you.
All right, we were scheduled for about another 9 minutes, and it sounds like there's desire for folks to open up the breakout rooms and just have some open discussion about both this presentation and more broadly. I want to thank Bini for joining us today and for that fantastic presentation. I think it's really great to just bear this whole, history in mind, that we're standing on the shoulders of giants and monsters, and we have to reckon with both. So, yeah, thank you so much. It was really a rich presentation. Everyone should check out the book. I also shared some other resources. Bini was on a mutual friends podcast, The Antifada, recently, which I think is a great interview as well. So thank you so much. And I will open up the breakout rooms now. If you have to jump out, obviously that's fine. They're totally optional. And we are going to start again with Catherine Rottenberg at 5 p.m. She's graciously joining us very late at night in London to fill in for Delard Derick tonight. So that is what, in like 90 minutes now, is that right? Too many time zones to bear in mind. And I know there's been some confusion about the time zones, so just Google it, 5 p.m. Eastern and blah, blah, blah. I'm on the West Coast, so I'm also translating into what have you. So thanks again, that was great. And I'm gonna open up the breakout rooms now.
Thank you for the discussion. Thank you very much.